Hello, global gardeners, and welcome to another edition of Your Gardening Week Live. This is the chance we have to get together on Mondays, talk about gardening, and do the things we want to do to start our gardening week. I know some of you have already been out this morning. I'll be going out a little bit later. And I've been watching the live stream so far, and I've been asked this question in the past. Why do I always start by taking a drink of my tea and then I start talking? Well, as many of you have already identified in the chat, there's a delay, and it's hard to tell exactly how long that delay will be. So when I first started these live streams and I was doing a little bit of testing, I determined on my end it looked like it was about 10 to 15 seconds of delay. So if I hit the go live, take a pause, take a drink, and then start talking, most of that delay is taken care of. But now I'm seeing feedback that it may be 30 to 45 seconds of delay. So who knows what all the factors are from my end to your end, but I will try to make a point in the future to delay just a little bit more before we jump right into the gardening topics, because I don't want you to miss a second. So let's start over again. Here's my drink. Now let's get started with the live stream today. And hello, global gardeners. You are truly a global audience. Let's go ahead and start with a question that we had from Cherry Pie in Cape Town. It's so great to have you here today, Cherry Pie. And the question is that my potatoes are all in one single container. Do I wait for all of the plants to start dying before harvest? And this is a really good question. So if you haven't grown potatoes before, one of the indications that it's time to harvest is when the plants die back. And so typically that's what you do. You let the plants die back, you withhold watering for a few days, and then the potatoes are ready to harvest. But if you're growing all in a single pot or a single bag, different plants are going to mature at different rates. And so you're probably going to have some of the plants starting to die back while other plants are still green and active. So it can be a dilemma, as Cherry Pie is asking. When do you harvest when you have a big container and some are ready and some aren't? And so you can approach this a couple different ways. You can wait until all the plants die back, and then you can be assured that they're all ready to harvest. The issue with this, depending on your humidity and how moist your soil is, it is possible that some of those plants that were first to mature, the tubers that are in the ground, the potatoes, should be fine. There should be no problem. But in a really damp environment, because that plant is no longer growing and absorbing that moisture, you can see the potential for some rot to develop in those plants if you wait too long. On the other side, if you harvest too early while some of the plants are still green, you'll get small tubers from those plants. And so is there a happy medium? Well, yes, there can be. And some of that just comes with experimentation and with practice, where you see a percentage, let's say 60 to 70% of the plants have died back. That may be a good time to go ahead and harvest. And I would go ahead and harvest all of them. Those plants that haven't died back will still have the tubers. They'll be what's often referred to as new potatoes. They're young potatoes, and they just haven't grown to full size yet. They're still perfectly edible, and you can harvest and use them. So I would go ahead and suggest that 60 to 70% range for harvesting. Harvest all of them, and then see how you like it. See how it turns out. If you didn't get enough of the bigger tubers, well, then next time wait until you have 80% of the plants dying back. And you just kind of have to reach that happy point for you. But when I've grown in containers, there's always some of the plants that are still green when it comes time to harvest, and I haven't had an issue with it. And I've never had any issues with rotting because I make sure that the soil doesn't stay saturated when we reach that point where it comes time to start harvesting. So hope that helps. Good to see everybody. Nicole Bateman is here, says new to your channel. Love everything you're sharing. It's great to have you here, Nicole. This is a great group of gardeners. For those of you who might be new, I'll be talking for the next 90 minutes and sharing information and answering your questions. We have a couple moderators on. Heidi and Jay are moderators. They'll help keep the conversation going as well. There are a lot of expert gardeners that are also participating from all over the world. So if you have a question, ask the question. I'll try to see it and try to answer it. But if I don't, chances are there'll be somebody else that answers your question too. So it doesn't all have to be focused on me. A lot of this is the community with all of us working together. And I want to give a shout out with that thought in mind to York Stephanie, who has started a gardening group in the neighborhood. And I think that is fantastic. You say that you already have some great positive feedback. I'm sure it's going to be successful by just getting involved, getting groups of neighbors and friends together, starting a gardening group. So I'm so glad to hear that. And I'm glad you took that step. I've been encouraging all of the regular viewers to take those kind of steps to improve your own network by expanding it and bringing others into the gardening world. And so that's fantastic to start a gardening group. Had another question from Ann Brumfeld, wondering when and how much to water shrubs and trees in winter. And I think this is a fantastic question. Much of it depends on your winter and how severe it is. But yes, definitely continue to water shrubs and trees and all perennial plants during the winter. The question, as you point out, is when and how much. So a general guideline is that when the daytime temperature has warmed above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about 5 degrees Celsius, that's a point that you can use as a guideline to get out and water. However, the soil shouldn't be frozen. So for me, for instance, every single night is below freezing. And so even when the days warm up above 40 degrees, I could go out and water, but the ground is frozen. So that water has nowhere to go. It's mainly the time of year when the days are starting to warm and there's a comparable warming in the night as well. And so if there's no snow cover, and if that top inch or two looks like it's no longer frozen, then any time that it's 40 degrees Fahrenheit or 5 degrees Celsius, go ahead and get out and water. I usually do it with a hand waterer of some type, like just a watering can. For me, if I bring the hose out to water, well, then the hose is going to freeze overnight with any residual water that's left in it. And now the next time I want to go water, I can't use the hose because the hose is frozen. So I use a watering can or some other way to hand water and try to do it on a regular basis. This isn't one of those things where winter comes and then you go out and 5 months later when winter is over, you water again. You need to water throughout the season. And you may notice, particularly lawns, if you have a lot of lawn damage in spring, a lot of winter kill, it could be because you didn't water during the winter. And it's particularly difficult to try to keep lawns alive in environments like that, where you can't get out with a hose and you're not going to turn your sprinkler system on. But that's why you have the damage in your lawn, is because you didn't water, especially in a region like mine that's very cold in the winter and very dry. So try to do it as often as possible. I was out in December. We had some pretty warm days in December and no snow. Unusual for that time of year for me here in Colorado, Zone 5B. Very little snow in December, but the days were warming up into the 60s Fahrenheit. That's above 15 degrees Celsius. And I had to get out and water by hand my fruit trees and my shrubs and a lot of the perennial area. I haven't watered since because we have had some pretty good snow cover, which is one of those things. If you're getting snow, then you really don't need to worry too much about watering. But realize, here's another rule of thumb, that snow is not enough water for many of our landscapes. So divide the amount of snow you get by 10. That's a rough estimate, and that'll tell you the amount of precipitation. So if you have 10 inches of snow, that's the equivalent of about 1 inch of rain. And so if you get 4 inches, well, let's say 5 inches of snow. I had about 5 inches of snow this last month. That's the equivalent of about half an inch of rainfall. So you do need to take into account how long it's been since you watered, if the snow is even getting any water into the soil, and bring that into your calculation as well. So hope that helps out a little bit. And I want to thank Patrick, Winter Tree and Shrub Watering. Thank you for that super chat contribution. It's always nice to see. I am planning a video. I wanted to do it this year and then didn't get to it. So I've already started some filming, but it might not come out either for a couple months. I'm guessing probably next winter, to do a discussion about winter gardening specifically. I have a video coming out in the spring where I'll talk about just watering your garden in general. And that's some of the footage that I shot, and I'll talk a little bit about winter watering. But don't forget it. It's an important step. You got to keep your plants alive during the winter. And for example, garlic. I have a bed of garlic growing, and I'll go out and hand water that garlic bed during the middle of winter, just to make sure that the cloves that are in the ground aren't desiccating. They're not drying out. So keep at it. It's difficult to overwater in winter, so it's better to get out there and water. And maybe you've got a little bit too much and it runs off because the ground is frozen. That's better than not getting out at all and all your plants dry up and you have some damage. So there you go. Joyful Alessi says, good morning back at you. Glad I found you searching bucket gardening. What's a good bucket garden soil mix for herbs, peppers, tomatoes, etc.? So for the most part, a general potting soil blend is good enough. Those are soilless blends, so it's going to be a mix of peat moss or cocoa coir or compost, forest products, a lot of organic material without really any soil in it. And so if you're growing in a bucket and you're growing in a soilless mix, you might need to add some type of mineral component. And so you'll see people adding rock dust, for instance, if they're growing in buckets. I use my own potting soil blend when I grow in buckets. And so it's a blend of peat moss and perlite. I'll also usually put a half-half mix of perlite and vermiculite, and then put some compost in there. That is one situation where I do fertilize, because the soilless mixes, especially if you make it yourself, doesn't have a lot of nutrient value for those plants when they start growing. So you'll probably have to add a balanced fertilizer as the plants are first starting to grow, and then you'll need to do another application as they're beginning to set flower and fruit. And depending on the plants and how long your season is, you may need another application later in the season as well. But just a general potting soil is usually enough. I don't usually recommend garden soil, like you dig up your garden soil and put it into a bucket and grow in that, because it does tend to be relatively dense. And I don't get as much root development in a bucket if the roots don't have room to spread and it's a dense mix. So soilless mixes usually work pretty well. And then, as I showed in another video, I take those buckets or those grow bags that have that organic material in it, and then I'll use that to amend my raised beds at the end of the season. And then in the spring, I'll fill the buckets or the grow bags with new material and start it all over again. So try seeing what you like. You can buy some potting soil mixes and you can make your own and see how well your plants do, and that'll give you a good idea of what you prefer and how to continue on in the future. Okay, Let's Grow says, I have a foot of snow on my garden. I'm guessing you're in a zone similar to me. Most of our snow has melted because we've had some really warm days recently, but that's awesome. Snow is an incredible insulator, and so even if you live in an area like a zone 5, like I'm in, if you have a steady snow cover through the winter, you might be able to get away with growing some zone 6 and some zone 7 plants, because that snow is essentially keeping the temperature right at freezing, which means the plants that are growing are essentially growing in a much higher zone. My zone is minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And if I had a steady snow cover all year round, I would be growing essentially in a zone 7 or a zone 8 garden. So I think that's great that you've got snow cover actually. Lena Abby's asking, how early should we prune pepper starts to make sure they get bushy? So I usually wait until I have about 4 to 5 true sets of leaves. Now I've seen gardeners that do it after 3 sets of leaves. Part of it is how you're going to grow the pepper plants once you put them outside. And so you can pinch off those growing points after the second set of true leaves, and the plant will start bushing from that point. And so if you haven't done this before and you're growing peppers or chilies, look really close right where the leaves are coming out of the stem, and you'll see 2 little nodules right there on each side, between the leaf and the stem. If you cut the stem just above that, those nodules will develop into new stems. And so that's a way to get your pepper plants to be bushier, is you cut the growing tip above one of those junctions, and now those nodules grow into new stems and you have a bushier plant. Well, in my area, when I'm putting out in the garden, for airflow in particular, I like to have the lower 8 to 12 inches of stem free so that air can blow through it. And that typically coincides to about the 4th set of true leaves. And so think about that as to when you pinch off your peppers. The main stem, how much space do you want between the stem and the soil? And that will determine when you start pinching it off. If you want a really bushy plant with a really low setting where those lower stems are very close to the ground, then you would pinch off the growing points sooner, because it's possible, and it's actually a really good idea. You can pinch off that main growing stem, and then you'll have 2 stems develop from there. Well, you let those grow a little bit, and then you pinch them off, and you'll get the same growth. You'll get 2 more growing from each of those stems. So just by doing it twice, you go from a single stem to 4 stems by just continuing that pruning and getting a bushy plant. So you can get very, very bushy. Practice it. Try it out. See what you like. But I would say wait until it gets a little bit taller, just to make sure the plant is strong enough and it's going to be the size you want when you put it out in your garden. So hope that helps out. I want to talk a lot about seeds today. I've been getting a lot of questions about seeds, and I've done some recent videos, and even though I try to answer a lot of questions in those videos, often those videos generate more discussion and more questions. And so even with the videos I've done talking about the different types of seeds, I'm getting a lot of questions about hybrid seeds in particular. And so the questions tend to revolve around saving seeds and then planting those seeds that you've saved, and how that really works when you're growing a hybrid seed. And so I think some of the confusion comes in when we are talking about hybrid seeds and hybrid plants, and maybe thinking those are 2 different things, and that you'll get different results from whether you put a hybrid plant in the ground or you grow a plant from a hybrid seed. Essentially, they're the same. A hybrid plant has grown from a hybrid seed. And a hybrid seed is developed when you take 2 different types of plants, 2 different parents, and you cross-pollinate them. That plant fruits, and then you save that fruit and get the seeds from it. Those seeds are now hybrids. And so a very basic way to try to understand this, it happens a lot with tomatoes. We probably buy more tomato hybrids and grow them in our garden than any other type of plant. So let's say you have a big red juicy tomato that is one of the parents, and we'll say that's the male part of the flower that we're using. And then we have another plant a tomato that has a really small yellow fruit. And that'll be the female component. So when we cross-pollinate the big red and the small yellow, conceivably, the resulting seed will produce a plant that has some characteristics of the male parent and some characteristics of the female parent. And so what we might get is a medium-sized orange tomato that's also really juicy and tasty. And if you plant those seeds of that orange tomato, that first generation hybrid, you'll see it identified on seed packages as an F1. That's what we expect to get, because these seed producers have learned that if you take that particular male parent and pair it with that particular female parent, the seed produced will give you consistently that orange sweet tomato. That's how hybrids work. But it only works for that generation. So now if we save that orange tomato fruit, collect those seeds, and then plant those seeds the next year in our garden, there's no telling what you're going to get. You might get a tomato that is unlike the parent male, unlike the parent female, and unlike the hybrid. And as I've mentioned before in earlier streams, I did this using sun gold tomatoes, which is a small orange sweet tomato. I saved the seeds at the school garden. I devoted 2 different beds to growing the plants from the seeds that we had collected the previous season. So now we were putting in second generation seeds, which would be categorized as F2. And those plants generated fruit that was all over the board. We had red tomatoes, we had orange tomatoes, we had yellow tomatoes. They ranged in size from small cherries to about medium-sized slicing tomatoes. None of them tasted as good as the sun gold. None of them had the same flavor. None of them had the same size. Even those orange tomatoes that developed in that second generation looked kind of like the sun gold, but they tasted terribly. So that's basically how hybrids work. You can save the seed of your hybrids, and like me, you can test them and see what results. But don't expect that those second generation plants will be anything like the first generation plants. And that's why the terminology we use in the gardening world is that if you plant the hybrid's offspring, it won't bear true to the parent. And so if you plant the sun gold, which is a hybrid tomato, if you plant the seeds from those sun gold tomatoes, the plants won't be true to that sun gold parent. So I hope that clears up some of the misunderstanding. Hybrid seeds are not any worse than non-hybrid seeds. They're not necessarily better than heirlooms. They're not necessarily worse than heirlooms. It all comes down to what you're looking for in your garden. As far as taste, disease resistance, color, there's many other factors. But I do understand that growing hybrids can be a bit confusing. So let me know if you have any more questions about that. Hopefully that helped out and generated some discussion. Good to see you here, Gladys. Don't worry about being late. I'm glad to see that you're here. Lots of good discussion. So you can already see, those of you that are new, that Jay Dixon and Heidi Clark are staying very active. Laura Full is always active. Kevin is a Florida gardener growing peppers, Kevin's in Georgia growing, Paul is the one that's in Florida growing peppers. And so you can see from the names of a lot of these gardeners that where they're growing and what their contribution is to this discussion. Lots of good experience, lots of good different types of growing environments. So that's why I always say to ask your question. Scott Head is on today, and so Scott Head is a Texas gardener now that we're talking about where we're all from. And Scott Head has the Scott Head Black Gumbo channel, lots of good videos. He was on a couple weeks ago. We shared the live stream, so good to see you here today, Scott. Hope you're advancing quickly on your gardening season. I did get some seeds started. You may have seen that in the video that I did on Saturday, where I put some of my perennial seeds in some core pellets and some peat pellets, and they've started. So I have put seeds on the ground. It's still too early for me to be starting peppers and tomatoes and all the rest. I'm about 2 weeks away from starting my pepper seeds. So I'm going to be taking a trip next week to go see my son and his family. And then when I come back, I'll be starting pepper seeds. So I think I'm going to be taking one of those pepper seeds for the single seed challenge this year. And so Scott Head, you may recognize from his videos and other videos that reference him as well for the single seed challenge. And so I think I've got it narrowed down to a couple different peppers. I haven't decided completely, but in a couple weeks I'll be doing my single seed challenge video as I start my peppers indoors. So I know a lot of you have already started your peppers. Some of you got peppers growing, and I know some of you have already started hardening off some of your plants to put them out. So I just think that's absolutely incredible that it's already time for many of us. And this is such a good time of year as many of us are getting started, because even in the Southern Hemisphere, those of you in Cape Town and other places that are listening and watching today, your season's still going. So we have that wonderful time where pretty much the whole planet is either starting their season and starting to grow, or just finishing the season, and we're all growing, and we're just about to hit that time. So I think that's great. So there's Pepper Paul, says Gardener Scott, made a bunch of potting soil, 3-3-1 mix with peat, worm castings, and composted manure, perlite, and organic fertilizer. Any problems alternating worm castings with composted manure? No problem at all. The big difference, one of the reasons I like worm castings is mainly because of the microbes that live in the earthworm's gut. So those are great soil microbes, all the bacteria, and they can be very beneficial for the soil. And so I think getting those bacteria, those microbes into the soil is a big reason why you would use the worm castings. It's a very small nitrogen component. There are some pretty high mineral components depending on what you feed your worms. But it is a little bit different than compost, because compost typically doesn't have the mineral composition, and it has different types of microbes. So no problem at all alternating them. I actually use a blend. I'll have compost and worm castings in my potting soil just to try to get the best of both worlds. But check it out, see what you like. This is one of those keep track of it in your journal kind of things, where you grow some plants in the primary compost blend, see how they do, and then you grow the same or similar plants in the worm casting blend and see how they do. And if it's a noticeable difference between the two, now you can justify your preference going into the future, whether it's mostly compost or mostly worm castings. I don't have a lot of worm castings with the amount of worms I have, and that's why I usually just put the castings in my potting mix as an extra to the compost. Compost is still primary for me just because I have more compost to use than I have worm castings. But check it out and yeah, alternate it, see what happens. Okay, Riverdale is checking or here. I'm glad to see you back, Riverdale. I know that you've been absent for a while. I'll be choosing a pepper as well for the single seed challenge in 3 weeks or so. And so I'm not sure if this is River or Dale that is doing the single seed challenge, but that's awesome. I hope to see back. And in a few weeks, when we all have reached that point where we're starting our seeds, I'll bring this discussion back up and we can talk about the seeds that we've chosen for our single seed challenge. For the live stream, for sure. Now that I'm thinking about it, I might even build that into one of my videos when I'm talking about the single seed challenge. I can take some of the examples that others have used as well. So that's good. That's great. Jennifer Segrist says, bought my supplies, going to start planting indoors this coming weekend. Yay to you, Jennifer. I think that is awesome. That's one of those things that even though I was just using peat pellets and it was just flower seeds, it really was an incredible feeling to finally have something growing that I can look forward to in this upcoming season. So I definitely feel your excitement. I think that's awesome. Yeah, and Scott, if you haven't raised worms, you should think about it, especially if you like using worm castings in your garden. It's the most cost-effective way to do it. The biggest issue I have is the limited amount of kitchen scraps I have, then making the choice of whether they go to the worms or they go to the compost pile. And so that's really the hardest part I have with the worms, is just balancing the food needs of the worms against the requirements of the compost pile. So Pika Iso is asking, I want to ask about saving seed true to type and how I can make sure that it doesn't cross-pollinate. And that ties in with some of the discussion of the hybrid seeds that we were talking about just a little while ago. So much of it depends on what the plant is that you're saving the seed from. If I want to save seed and I want to be sure that it is true to type, I'll typically only grow that type of plant. So for instance, tomatoes. If I'm doing a giant pumpkin experiment and I want to save the seed from the giant pumpkins, I will hold off growing other type of pumpkins anywhere nearby. And if I do have squash growing, I will try to shift my growing season enough. So something like giant pumpkins need to be started as early as possible because they need time to grow. So while they're growing, I'm not putting any other squash types in the garden. Once the pumpkins have reached that point where they're about to start flowering, now I'll start all of my other squashes and pumpkins, so that when those giant pumpkins are flowering, there are no other squash plants in the garden that could pose any issues with cross-pollination. That's the way I do it, to ensure that I get seed that is true. In other words, nothing else in the garden that could possibly cross-pollinate those plants or those seeds I'm trying to save. Another option, particularly with the larger flowers like the pumpkins, is to hand pollinate. And you basically have to get out in the morning before the bees wake up and hand pollinate those flowers. And I've got a video that shows how to hand pollinate squashes and pumpkins and similar plants. So that's another way to help ensure that the flowers stay true. You can also put some type of barrier around the plant to keep the pollinators out. So you use a row cover, for instance, over hoops over those plants. It depends on the plant and whether they need a pollinator for pollination or not. There are many plants that we grow, like the beans and the peppers and the tomatoes, that are most likely to pollinate themselves. They don't require an insect to come in and pollinate. So if you want to grow a pepper and you want to ensure that it stays true, well, then cover up that pepper plant with just a mesh bag or something to keep the insects out while it's flowering. You can get in there and shake the plant. You can help to loosen up the pollen so that it's all within the same flower. The male pollen will fall onto the female pollen. That's one way to ensure that it stays true. The whole idea is basically you keep the pollinators away from your plants during the point where they would be pollinated. And so I hope that helps. Those are a couple different methods that I use. The easiest for me, and that's why I do it, is just to stagger my planting times so that when the plants are flowering, there's no issue with it. And I mentioned in one of those earlier videos, that's what I do with my cucumbers, because I'll grow different types of cucumbers and I just stagger the plantings so that when the one I want to save is in flower, there's no other cucumbers that are flowering. So that's how I do it. Hope that helps. Claudia Villanova is saying, last Saturday I cleaned my strawberries. They had lots of worm castings. The soil is loose with all the worm castings. Do I need to add something else? Probably not. The only way to be sure is to do a soil test and see if there is a nutrient deficiency in your soil. But if I'm guessing you've got lots of earthworm activity, then that's showing you've got a really nice, rich organic soil. And if there's earthworms, there's going to be bacteria and fungi, and that's probably the signs of a very healthy soil. So see how your strawberries are doing. If they're growing fine and you're getting the fruit and the plants look happy, then I'd say no, you probably don't need to add anything at all. If the plants look like they're suffering and you notice a decrease in the earthworm activity, that might be the time to for sure get a soil test just to identify which nutrients are lacking, or just keep adding more compost and organic matter and let the natural environment moderate the soil for you, and it'll become nutrient rich. So that's great. Liz H., welcome to the garden support. Welcome to the channel. For those of you that don't know, if you look underneath, if you're watching this on a computer, you'll see the join button, the little blue and white button. You can join the Gardener Scott community. It's a great way to support the channel. You can get some nice perks and benefits. One of the things I know a lot of you participate in, and it's really a great, if you're a member of that Gardener Scott community, you can join the Facebook group. It's a private group. Lots of great photographs are being shared, lots of great information being shared, in addition to extra things like extra live streams that are for the members of that community. No obligation, no requirement, all the rest of this. This is free. My videos are free. That's just an extra way that if you like the videos and you like what I'm doing, it helps support the channel. And Liz H. is the newest member, so great to have you on board. Okay, let's see. A garden girl saying, should determinate tomato plants be hilled or pruned? Generally, no. Now, it does depend on the specific plant, but in general, a determinate tomato plant, I prune very lightly. And it's usually only at the very base of the plant as it's getting bigger and bushier and starting to set flower and starting to fruit. I want to make sure I still get some good airflow so that I don't have some type of disease, a soil-borne disease that might infect the leaves. So I will prune the bottom of my determinate tomato plants just like I do my indeterminate tomato plants. But the whole point of growing, one of the main points, I should say, of growing a determinate tomato plant is that it will set flower and fruit pretty close to the same time. So within a 2-week period, you'll have your entire harvest off of a determinate tomato plant. There's really no reason to prune if that's the reason you're growing, because you want the maximum amount of fruit during that critical harvest time. Now, pruning does tend to focus more plant energy on the fruit. So if you grow a determinate plant and you get a ton of fruit, but it's a lot of fruit that's smaller than you expected, well, that's probably because you didn't prune. So if you prune lightly, you'll tend to get bigger fruit. You won't get as much fruit, but you'll get bigger fruit. So I would say go ahead and grow some determinate tomato bushes because they tend to be bushy. Harvest, see if you're happy with the harvest. If the fruit is too small, well, then the next time you grow that plant, do some selective pruning and see if you get bigger fruit, which is maybe what you're after. But no, generally I don't do any of the stuff to the determinants. Now with the indeterminates, yes, I do a lot of pruning on the indeterminates. As far as the hilling, I plant my plants deep, so I don't have a need for hilling because the roots will be developing on everything that I've buried. But give it a shot. I don't prune my determinants much at all. Prepper Chris is asking, best time to start air layering trees? That's an interesting question. And so air layering is a way of propagating trees, often with fruit trees. And when my trees get a little bit bigger, I'll be doing some air layering as well. And you basically just bruise the branch and cover it with something like a moss, and you enclose that in a baggie or some type of plastic cover. That branch will develop roots, and then you can cut that branch off of the tree, and it's it's ready for planting. It's already developed roots, and you can put it in the ground. Depending on the tree, and I know you're in a different region than mine, but you definitely need to wait until the plant is actively growing for best results. So if you do it during the winter, like now, for me, where it's too cold out and the plant is dormant, you're not going to get the results that you're probably after. So wait until the tree is actively growing, and then do it as early as possible so that you have as much of the season as possible for those roots to develop. It works better in areas with longer growing seasons. And so for me, for instance, I wouldn't be able to even think about doing it before May, just because it's too cold and because the trees aren't even really leafing out until about that point. But I would be doing it probably the end of May, beginning of June. And then that gives me probably a good 3 to 4 months for some of those roots to start developing. And it takes a while. And then I could get some of those new trees in the ground in September. And so end of September, early October. So when I try it, that's going to be my approach. Basically, end of May to beginning of September is my target. But I haven't done it, so we'll see. Hope that helps. Okay, let's see what else we have. Yeah, Jay Dixon, thank you so much for putting the link to Scott Head's Single Seed Challenge for a video to check it all out. I appreciate that. That's wonderful. Laura B saying, what's your take on raised beds? Are they as good as regular gardens? So I have a whole bunch of videos on this topic. I think I've got 2 videos specifically about the benefits of raised beds. I have one video specifically about the problems with raised beds. I have another video that talks about mistakes that are often made when you do raised beds. So I've in my library, I've got some great videos about raised beds. I have another video I'm planning on coming up, or it's going to come up. I think it's programmed for April, early April, where it's going to be in the same video, pros and cons. And so much of it gets to how you garden, why you garden, and what you want to get from gardening, and whether a raised bed has a benefit that matches what you're looking for. One of the best benefits for me is that I can garden easier in a raised bed. I have back issues, so it's difficult for me to get down on my knees in open ground and bend over and deal with the plants face to face. Whereas in a raised bed that is 2 feet high, I can sit on the edge of the bed and do all that face to face plant time. So that's for me one of the biggest benefits. In my area, the soil is terrible. I mean, really, really bad. So for me to grow in the ground, I have to do a lot of soil amending, a lot of organic material just to get my native soil to the point where I can put plants in. Not to count just the drainage issues and how dense my soil is. In a raised bed, I can bring in or create from scratch all of the soil I want and design it specifically to match what I want to grow. So for me, those are the 2 biggest benefits. Is it's easier to work, and because my in-ground soil is so bad, I can bring in good soil to fill those raised beds. There are many other benefits, but there are some issues as well. I'd say go ahead and take a look at some of those videos that I have, because it really comes down to how you want to garden. If you've got great soil and if you've got a healthy back and you don't mind getting down on your hands and knees to weed the patch as necessary and to prune and thin out as needed, then there's nothing wrong with in-ground gardening. Just like I don't think there's anything wrong with raised bed gardening, and there's nothing wrong with container gardening. Garden how you want to garden. Don't let someone else tell you the best method. You've got to figure out what's best for you. For me, raised beds pretty much hands down is best for me. I have a lot of fruit bushes. I've got fruit trees. I've got perennial flowers in my open beds. But when it comes to vegetable gardening, pretty much exclusively it's in raised beds, because that's what I've found works best for me. Give it a try. Figure out what you like. If you're new to raised bed gardening, I would suggest starting with just 1 or 2 raised beds and see what you think. If you've only done raised beds, I would say the next area that you're planning on putting a raised bed in, maybe consider not doing a raised bed and doing some in-ground growing and see how you like that as well. That's a great way to become a better gardener, is just to do different methods and compare them and see what you like best. So York Stephanie, welcome to the Gardening Scott community as a member. So glad that you joined us today. That's nice to see you. Thanks so much. And thanks, Kevin. And you'll see this is a perfect example of Georgia Gardener. Kevin is welcoming York Stephanie. This is just such a wonderful community, how we're all working together to help each other out, and it's all welcoming, and you'll see that on the Facebook group as well. It's just, you guys are so awesome here. It's so incredible. I want to talk a little bit today as well, since we're on this discussion about seeds and hybrid seeds and saving seeds. When you buy seeds from an online source or a nursery or a big box store, that's one of those things to look for on the package. If it's a hybrid seed that will grow into a hybrid plant, it is supposed to say it on the package. And so if you're planning on saving your seeds, that's the first way to figure it out. Read the package. Now, you get a lot of companies like Burpee, for instance. Burpee has created many hybrids of their own, and they often give them a name that has hybrid in it. And so it'll be like Burpee Hybrid Carrot Deluxe or whatever. Hybrid will be in the name. That's a very good indication. There are many others, like the Sun Gold, where it'll just be Sun Gold. But on the package somewhere, it'll say F1, which is the way to tell it's a hybrid. Or on the back, as you're reading the description, it'll say something like, this hybrid tomato has delicious flavor. So if you're going to be growing plants for the purpose of saving the seeds, start by reading the seed packet. And that'll be the first indication. The good seed packets will give you all the information you need to know. So when you go out to sow seeds in your garden, or if you're sowing seeds in a grow area for transplanting later, you should know how deep to sow that seed. You should know general care. You should know the thinning of the plants, how far apart they should be thinned so that you can grow them. You should know when you can grow them outside or when you can sow them outside. This is all very important information. It may or may not be on the seed packet. So I encourage that whenever you're getting all your packages together and you're going to go out and you're going to put seeds out in the garden, take some time to review the seed package first, because you're not going to find the same information on every package. And I do find it relatively annoying when I gather all my seed packages and I go out and I've got a plan and I'm going to have a row of this and a row of that and a block of this other thing, and I'm putting them in the beds, and I get my seed package and I open it up, and nowhere on the seed package does it tell me how deep I'm supposed to sow the seed. And especially, I love Baker Creek heirloom seeds, but there are a lot of Baker Creek heirloom seed packets that don't tell you how deep to sow the seed. And when you're all the way out in the garden ready to start sowing and you don't have some of that critical information, well, don't guess. Don't guess on how deep to sow the seed. Sure, there's a general rule of thumb that says you sow the seed twice the width of the seed. So especially for bigger seeds, you're going to sow them deeper. And very small seeds, they're going to be more shallow. But that's not always the case. There are some seeds that need light for germination. There are some seeds that need dark for germination. So do a review of your seed packet before you ever go out to actually put those seeds in the ground, just to save you some of that frustration. Because there are many of these seed producers that have that information, but you've got to go to their website to get the information, or you have to look in the catalog to get the information. And I want it to be easy. When I'm out in the garden, I want to stay in the garden and get those seeds in the ground. And so having to stop and break that process to go in and try to look it up online to find out what the appropriate depth is or what the appropriate spacing is, I just kick myself every time I forget to do that. Take the effort beforehand, and I'll write on the seed packet. If I get a seed packet that I've ordered and I do a review of it as soon as it arrives, if I notice that some of that critical information is missing, then I'll go ahead and just write it on the seed packet as soon as I get it, as soon as I do that review, so that when it comes time to put them out in the garden, I've got all the information I need at hand. Because believe me, it's one of those things, even when you've been doing this as long as I have, and you get out, there's one of those, like peas, for example. There are peas that you might sow 1 inch deep, and there are peas that you might sow 2 inches deep. And so if you don't know which is which, it might hurt to guess. So just be sure ahead of time. That's that's a tip for the week, is just get everything lined up, ready to go before you go out with your seed packets, and make sure they've got all the information you want on them. Okay, let's see. Jenny Simon saying, write it on the plant tag. Yeah, that's actually a really good idea too. I do also recommend, like I mentioned in the video with the peat pellets, get your plant tags all ready to go as you're putting the plants either into a bigger pot or out into the garden. As soon as you're going to be putting the seeds in place or the seedlings in place, the plant tag should be there ready to go. And I've done that before too. If you plan on reusing your plant tags, it's a great idea. Where on the front side, I'll often put like sugar snap pea, and then on the back side, I'll put other information like when I sowed it, the spacing, how deep it is. So great point. I'm glad you bring that up, because I have done that in the past, especially more so at the school garden when I was working with students. And so as the plants were growing, if they would ask a question, we could look at the plant tag and know exactly when we sowed it and how far apart we sowed it and how deep we sowed it. And so that's all good information for a plant tag, definitely. And so if you haven't done that before, add that to your bag of tricks when you're putting your plant tags together. Thanks for that, Jenny. Okay, Garden Girl is saying, my planter's in part sun and shade because of a tree nearby. What can be grown? There's a ton of stuff that can be grown. Start with what you want to grow, and then see if there's a variety that can grow in an environment like that. There's a lot of plants that we typically grow in our vegetable garden, a lot of herbs, a lot of lettuce crops that do great without full sun all day long. So I would start by doing an analysis during the growing season to find out just how much sun that particular spot is getting. And if it's at least 6 hours, then you can grow pretty much anything. The more sun, the better. If you want to grow peppers and tomatoes, I would recommend at least 8 hours or 10 hours of direct sun a day. But you can still grow all those plants with 6 hours of sun. If you have less than 6 hours of sun in that particular spot, then you would probably have more success with the plants that are more tender, that are growing in cooler conditions, like spinach and kale, and a lot of those root crops like beets and turnips. And so do an analysis first, figure out how much sun you're really getting, and then that'll help you decide the plants that you grow by doing a review of the plant requirements if you've chosen a plant that you want to grow, and then match it to that particular spot. And so I didn't see you check in yet, but I see Jay Dixon is talking to Tony from Simplified Gardening. And so there he is. So Tony O'Neill from Simplified Gardening in Wales, UK is with us today. Good to see you, Tony. Just did a great video about compost and some good reasons why you should compost. So be sure and check out both Scott Head and Tony O'Neill's Simplified Gardening channel, because we're all pumping out information for you to really make your gardening as easy as possible and as knowledge packed as possible. So good to see you joining us here today. Luz is saying, can you all please educate me on why a self-pollinating plant needs a companion plant? I know the basics about more fruit bearing, but is it that? Self-pollinating plants, and this, it's easiest to describe when we talk about trees, for instance. And so I think I mentioned a little bit about this last week or the week before. We were talking, I guess it's been a couple weeks ago now, talking about apple trees and how apple trees are not self-pollinating. They require a different type of apple tree, a different variety, to be able to set the fruit and give you a harvest. So you need two different types of apple trees to get fruit. You have many trees like plum trees that are sold as self-pollinating. And some of these trees will have flowers where the flower has both the male parts and the female parts. So you'll have different types of flowers, male flowers and female flowers on a single plant. A lot of fruit bushes fall into this category. And the plant can self-pollinate, but a pollinator has to go from flower to flower. There are other plants, like I talked about earlier with the peppers and the tomatoes, that have the male part and the female part, the stamen and the pistil, within the same flower, and they are self-pollinating. Well, the issue becomes, particularly for a lot of those plants where you need a male flower to pollinate a female flower. If you have a second type, so it's not really a companion plant, it is the same type of plant. So if you're growing plums, for instance, and you have a self-pollinating plum tree, you can get or expect to get plums off it. But if you have a second plum tree with a different variety, you will usually get more fruit. And it's just the way that the pollination works. It's the way genetics work, where you have genetics from one plant of a similar species. It generates the growth, and it generates usually a bigger harvest. It's not necessary, it's not needed if the plant is being sold as self-fertilizing. But it can be enhanced by growing another of that type, that species of plant. As far as companion planting, if you're thinking about, if I grow peppers next to tomatoes, the tomato self-pollination will be better. The only reason that might be true is because a pollinator attracted to the companion plant is there and now can pollinate the self-pollinating plant. But in itself, the companion plants really don't improve the pollination of self-pollinating plants. If you want better pollination, just grow a second plant of a different variety, and that's usually how you get an enhanced harvest. So hope that helps out a little bit. I know it can be confusing. Riverdale Garden says, I planted 4 fruit trees last spring and have 8 more coming this year. Awesome. I'm hoping you do a first-year pruning video. I am planning it. I have been looking at the weather very closely. Right now, I think I have it programmed either the last week of February or the first week of March. A video like that is coming out. I have a crab apple tree in my front yard that needs to be pruned, that I was looking at just the other day, figuring out how I'm going to prune it and how I'm going to shoot that video. And then I've got one apple tree in particular in the backyard that needs some drastic pruning. And then I have a lot of other fruit trees that just need a little bit of pruning. So yes, that video is coming. It'll be coming in a few weeks. Look for it. I'll say the first week of March is probably the most likely time. But if I can get it done before then, it'll come out before then. But definitely the video is coming. And I also will be discussing in that video a little bit about espalier. but I'm planning a separate video where I'll be talking about the first year in growing espalier to include the pruning. So that video will be coming too. So thank you for that suggestion. Yes, definitely. It's gonna happen. Okay, let's see. Yeah, Scott says, getting into fruit trees and learned a lot about pollination needs. Ended up buying 6 apple varieties just for the pollination help. And that's what I've done too. I think I've got 8 apple trees and 2 different crab apple trees, and it's for the pollination. You should have at least 2 apple trees growing nearby, but the more the better to have the best harvest possible. And it just has to do with the way the flowers are pollinated and how the genetics work in the requirement for the plant to get different genetics from a different type of apple in this case. So good for you, Scott. I look forward to seeing your videos on that as well. Matthew Bergen saying, my garlic sprouted over the last few weeks, but we're going to get some Arctic winds and are supposed to get as low as minus 12 Celsius. That will be cold. That's about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Will my garlic be fine? Yes, your garlic should be fine. I would suggest if you're getting snow, if you're going to get the snow before that really cold weather, the snow will insulate the sprouting garlic perfectly. And so that's ideal. That's what I like to see. I like to see the snow when my temperatures are dropping after it's sprouted, because the snow is insulating those garlic sprouts. Just to be on the safe side, if you haven't mulched, I would ensure that you have a light mulch in that area. I use straw. And you might consider putting a cover over that garlic if this is unusually cold for you, and if you've been experiencing much warmer temperatures. I would go ahead and suggest putting a simple cover, because that's cold enough that you can expect some damage on the leaves. It shouldn't kill the garlic, but you may have some leaf damage, which could hinder the growth of the plant, which means the bulbs will be smaller than you might get if you didn't have this cold weather coming. So take a row cover, some plastic, a tarp, a blanket, and the night before that cold weather hits, after you've mulched, go ahead and just cover up that space for a night or two as that cold weather hits and then dissipates. And that'll help ensure that you minimize the damage to the garlic. But garlic is a tough plant and can handle freezing conditions. That may be a little bit cold. So I would go ahead. I've done that. We had a real cold snap this last year. You can see it in the background of some of my videos this last year, where I had plastic over hoops over my garlic because it was just starting to sprout and I didn't want to have any damage. So there you go. Hope that helps. And Jay Dixon, you're awesome. Thank you for that reminder. Yeah, if you like what's happening on this channel and you like the videos and you want to see more and you want to help show your support, give a thumbs up. You can join if you want. You can buy the merchandise below the videos. You can donate via the super chat at the bottom. Just underneath where you type in your chat, you can give a super chat or a super sticker. And that all helps support the channel and helps everything I'm doing to keep doing this. So thank you so much for sharing that and letting the others know. You're just incredible. All of you are incredible. Okay, let's see what we have. Fork and allotment, a lot of good discussion. Linda and Fork and allotment are talking about cherry trees. Just so you know, Fork and allotment, I've killed cherry trees and apple trees as well. In fact, I don't grow cherry trees anymore. They just are not working in my area. I had a black Tartarian cherry tree and I had a Bing cherry tree, and I babied them and was able to keep them alive for, I think, 4 years. And then the Bing died, and then the next year the black Tartarian died. I just am not in an area that I can grow cherry trees very well. So for all of you, realize that even when I say go outside your comfort zone, try new things, plant these trees, plant those bushes, try all of the things to make yourself a better gardener, it isn't always successful. And that's why I got so much great advice, because I've learned so much from experience, and among them are the fruit trees. and the mistakes I've made along the way with fruit trees. So I feel your pain because I've killed cherry trees as well. They're beautiful trees, and I love the fruit. I just wish I could get them to grow. Thanks, Carla. I appreciate that. I'm glad you keep watching. This is wonderful. Oh, okay. And so yeah, so Vanessa's asking, who's the picture today? And so for those of you that might be new, I try on a regular basis to have a picture of your garden or your gardening picture behind me. And this one is actually from a few months ago. This is Julie Pizzolato, and the picture was much larger, but this is the portion that I was able to crop and use as a backdrop today. But I think it's a beautiful picture. You can see that it's the workbench. And so from the larger view, you can see there's a lot more plants in the background, and this is her workbench. But it's a nice vision, I think, of container gardening with the beautiful herbs and the lettuce growing on a bench. And this is just, especially for those of us in the middle of winter with nothing growing outside, I thought this was a real nice picture to share today. So this comes from Julie, and I appreciate you sending me this. It's taken a couple months to work its way up on the queue, and so now we're showing Julie's picture. And if you want your garden or your gardening picture to enter the queue and show up as a backdrop sometime, you can send it to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com, and that's a good way for me to receive it, and then I'll save it, and hopefully one week your picture will be the one I show as well. But I just thought this was a really nice lush green picture to show, especially for this time of year. So thanks, Julie, for sharing that, and thank you for asking so that we didn't forget to talk about it, because I often am looking and forgetting about mentioning these kind of things, because you're the ones that help keep this going, like with Julie sharing the picture. And I plan on doing another one next week. So tell me more about your story. And if you do send a picture, please do give me permission to use it. So send me the picture, tell me a little story, and then say that you give me permission. Just, I don't want to cause any copyright issues. If you send me a picture that maybe you don't own, that you took off of the internet or someplace else, if you just like a picture, you can send it to me as well. But if you want me to use it, I need to make sure that you have given me your permission to use it. So just one of those little technicalities, but I'd be glad to do it. So Chris is asking, do you have good places to buy bees and insects? I don't, mainly because I don't buy insects as a general practice. I have bought ladybugs in the past. I've bought praying mantid eggs and things like that. But I much prefer to buy flower seeds and grow those flowers and use those flowers to attract the bees and the other insects. It's a general problem, and I encourage everybody at least once in your gardening career to buy a bag of ladybugs. And you might have them in your local nursery. That's where I would check first, because they're more likely to be from your region if your nursery is selling them. There's also nurseries that have their own incubators for a lot of these different insects, and they'll sell you. You can buy online, you just don't necessarily know the source of the insects online. So I would encourage that you start with a nursery if you want to buy. But I suggest doing it, because if you buy a bag of ladybugs and put them in your garden, you will find that when you come out the next day, there won't be any extra ladybugs in your garden. They're going to be probably dehydrated from shipping, so you should water your plants beforehand. You'll put the ladybugs in place. They may or may not find any food, but they're more likely going to fly away because they're looking for a nesting site. And they're probably looking for their nesting site from where they were collected, because ladybugs will have populations, huge populations in caves and other spots. And so the harvesters of the ladybugs will come with big vacuum cleaners and suck up all the ladybugs, put them into bags, and then ship them to you. And so when they're released in your garden, they want to fly away home. and that's one of the first things they'll do. So it's a great exercise just so you can see it in action. It's great for kids to open up a bag of ladybugs and have them fly all over, but really don't expect that many of them are going to stay in your garden, because if you don't have the proper habitat for them, they're going someplace else. And that's why I say I prefer to go ahead and just create the habitat in the first place, and then all those insects will find my garden. I don't need to buy ladybugs or bees or anything else, because my garden is a nice, inviting location. And so as they're flying around looking for food and looking for shelter and looking for water, they're going to see my garden and they're going to land and they're going to do all the beneficial things they do. So that's the approach I take, and that's why I don't have a particular company to recommend. But check with your local nursery and see what they have. And good nurseries usually have some type of insects, or at least insect eggs, that you can try in your garden. So it is one of those kind of fun things to try. Okay, let's see what we have as we're rolling off. Mage Grey Wolf says, I once had a mantis find my yard. There you go. And it's incredible. So those of you that have been watching my videos on a regular basis know that I've just moved to this house and started this garden within the last year and a half. And this last season was my first growing season. So I literally started from scratch. I cleared the entire landscape and then started building beds, started putting plants and trees in, and started building out my garden space from nothing. Last year was my very first year growing plants in my garden space. And I had a green praying mantis that I found on my tomato plants, which were nice and green. And I found a brown praying mantis in my dried leaf pile that was right next to where I've put my lasagna garden. So I've got my lasagna garden bed, and there were a lot of dried material in it. These insects are incredible. So you have different colored insects, and they will come to an area that matches their color, because they don't want to be eaten by a bird. If you have a brown praying mantis on a green leaf, the bird's going to see it and it's going to come down and eat it. So you're going to have green insects on green plants, and you're going to have brown insects on brown plants. And in my very first season of growing, I had at least those two. Those were two that I saw. If I saw two, chances are there were a dozen that I didn't see. And that's why I say create the environment, and they will find your environment. Even in the first year, they will find the environment. And if you keep that environment inviting, then they will set up their own populations within your garden, and they'll return year after year as they lay their eggs, and those eggs hatch and they continue growing because you gave them the environment they like. So Mage Grey Wolf, that's awesome. I think that's great. You're obviously doing things right because they like your yard, and that's the way to do it. Is just keep growing a variety of plants, a lot of different plants, and you'll attract all those insects that you would want to buy. So Chris, there you go. Go out there and just keep growing lots of different types of plants, and the insects will come. Okay, Rachel McGraw saying, I got bare root Quinault strawberries. They're very easy to grow and inexpensive. I've been growing Quinault strawberries for 20 years. And so I think I mentioned it in a recent video, or maybe it was a live stream, where I was talking about strawberries and how I've propagated the strawberries. And as I move to new houses and new gardens, I take some of the strawberries with me. It's the Quinault strawberries that I have taken with me from house to house and garden to garden for 20 years. So Mère Dubois is a variety that I'll be growing for the first time this year. It's been recommended to me by a gardening buddy of mine that lives locally. He's had great success, and I've seen a lot of others that recommend it as well. So I'm adding more strawberries, but Quinault is always in my garden. So glad to see that you're growing those, Rachel. I think you'll like them. I love them. They give fruit pretty much all season long. Almost every day I can go out and pull off a strawberry on my Quinault strawberries throughout the season. So I accidentally love them. Yeah, Kathleen saying, love Quinault, very prolific. There you go. It's a great variety grow. Great one to do. Denver 1865 says a great kid activity in the garden is to look for all the different insects in the garden and have help looking up what they are and what they do. Absolutely. I love that. I love getting my grandkids out in the garden and doing that. My youngest granddaughter loves bugs, and it is a great activity to just search for the bugs in the garden. So that's a great activity. I'm glad you're doing that. Thanks for pointing that out as well. And so, yeah, Linda's asking, there's also got a couple different types of varieties. So I mentioned the Quinault and the Mar de Bois and Cavendish. Cavendish was the one I started growing last year. Didn't get a lot of fruit because I was plucking off a lot of flowers to get those plants developed in their first year. I did let them send out some runners so I could pot up some additional ones. So Cavendish was a new one that I grew last year. I haven't been as excited with the Cavendish as I have been with the Quinault, but those are the three main varieties. And then I ordered another new one, and the name escapes me right now. So going into this next season, I'm planning on growing 4 different types of strawberries, and I'll report back on how well they do in comparison with each other. So there you have it. Okay, Kevin's saying about $1 strawberry kit at Dollar Tree. They just sprouted, no idea the variety. And that's a great way to save money and grow plants, but with Dollar Tree, and you see this at like Costco and Walmart and even Lowe's and Home Depot, the big box stores, they'll just sell strawberry or raspberry or blackberry, and they might do well in your garden, they might not. I prefer, as you would probably guess, to know the varieties I'm growing so that I know what the specific needs are for that plant. Because while you can group all strawberries together, they do have slightly different requirements based on whether they're an ever-bearing or June-bearing. There's different types of strawberries. And so if you grow from a strawberry kit, there's nothing wrong with that. Just don't be surprised if you're not getting the fruit when you're expecting to get the fruit, because it might be a completely different type of strawberry variety from what you're used to or what maybe is also growing in your garden. So if you can find out the variety and find out what they're doing, I think it's a much better way to get the most out of your plants so that you know what to expect and therefore you can give the plants what they need. Stephanie Smith saying, I live in the same zone as you. What type of raspberries should I get? And when should I get them? So zones are very important for raspberries and blackberries. So I'll tell you what I recommend, but there are other considerations as well. And so here in Colorado, the strawberry that I prefer and that I've had great success with is Heritage. And Colorado State University has Heritage on their list of recommended raspberries. And that's what I would suggest to you as well, is check with your state university that sponsors the extension office, and they should have recommendations for the specific varieties that will do best in your area. And so raspberries will do great in most Zone 5 gardens, but you really do need to look at what's best for your particular climate and soil, because there is a pH consideration for raspberries as well. And so you should try to make sure that your pH matches the requirements of the raspberry. And you'll get that from your extension office and the university as far as recommendations for your particular climate in addition to the zone. If you are in an area where you don't have an extension office or you're outside the United States, so you don't have that same type of university support, then I would talk to the nurseries and other experienced gardeners in the area to find out what varieties they recommend. For me, it's Heritage. It is a raspberry that grows on the first year canes, the prima canes. And so the plant will grow, flower, and fruit all in one season. And one reason that works best for my climate and my region is because we have an insect called raspberry cane borer. And the adult will lay eggs in the raspberry canes. Those eggs will hatch and stay in the cane over the winter, and then the larva will eat its way out and kill the plant. So if you're growing a summer-bearing raspberry in an area with an insect like that, well, those type of raspberries, you have to leave the cane up over the winter because it's not going to fruit until the second year on the flora canes. And if you've got an insect like that, you're going to be rolling the dice as to whether you're even going to get a crop if the insects emerge and kill everything. So that's one reason why heritage is recommended for my area, is because not only it matches our soil and climate, but it matches the pest problems that we have for that particular type of raspberry. So do a little more research to see what's recommended for you, and that might help give you the exact answer you're looking for. Yeah, Linda's saying now, back to the Mardois, it's best in zones 4 to 7. I live in 8, so probably not best for me. You could still try it. This is one of those things we've talked in the past during the growing season last year. We were talking about ways to try to grow outside your zone. And so you might be able to set up a little microclimate. Look throughout your garden. And if you see a spot that is a little bit shadier, it's more sheltered, and it tends to stay cooler than the rest of your garden, you might be able to squeeze in something like that and have minimal success with it. But that's the way to try to grow if you're just outside what the plant is recommended. Just find a microclimate and you might actually be able to grow it. So you've got enough gardening experience, Linda, I would say you can go ahead and give that a shot and see if you can grow even a single container of something like Mar du Bois that's outside your zone, and see if you can make it happen. That's one of those things that gives great satisfaction when you can grow outside your zone and grow outside your limitations and then have success. So I hope you try it. I hope you have some success with that. And so Judy's asking, how do you feed heavy feeder brassicas like cabbage? And so I always look at the soil. Whenever it comes to feeding plants, I always look at the soil. I know my soil is deficient, particularly in nitrogen, my native soil. And so when I'm growing brassicas and corn and other heavy feeders like that, then because I know my soil is deficient in those nutrients, then I fertilize with those nutrients, like nitrogen for those heavy feeders. However, if I've been amending on a regular basis, and now, like we were talking earlier, we have that earthworm activity, and it's a rich soil, and we know we've got all the microbes, and we know we have a lot of organic material in our soil, then I don't feed at all, and my brassicas do just fine because the soil has all the nutrients it needs just with regular amending and regular mulching with compost. Like in a no-dig gardening method. If you have a rich soil and then continue to mulch with compost, then you won't need to feed your plants at all because you'll have a healthy soil environment and the plants can get everything they need. And then you take those brassicas at the end of the season and add them back to your compost pile, and they'll release the nutrients from those plants back into your compost, and then you use that compost again and you can grow brassicas because it becomes a complete cycle where the plants are absorbing nutrients and then they'll put a lot of those nutrients back into the compost when you compost them. So it depends on the soil and whether the soil needs additional nutrients, not whether the plant needs nutrients, but whether the soil needs nutrients to bring it up to a point where the plants can grow the way that we want them to grow. So that's the approach I take, and I hope that helps out. So, so I want to go ahead and shift to a little bit, and give me a second here because I want to change the background as we move into our phase of philosophy. And so this is Shaka. Shaka was my best friend in the garden for many, many years. And she passed over the Rainbow Bridge about 8 years ago, I think it is now. And so this morning, on the Facebook chat, Laura shared a picture of her friend who passed on yesterday as well. And so I wanted to spend this last few minutes of the stream today talking about our pets and our animals and our family members that are in our garden as well. And it's hard not to get choked up for me because Shaka was such a special friend. And so I encourage you, as you continue on your gardening journey, to not only get the kids involved, because that's been the theme of recent streams, to get the kids out in the garden, to look at your garden through the eyes of a child. Well, now, not only do I want to offer condolences to Laura because I know how it feels, but to also bring that into your life. It is so hard to lose a loved pet and family member, but to be able to have those moments in your memory where you shared the time together is priceless. And I wouldn't trade any of those times that we had. And Shaka would come out to the garden and she would just lie there for hours as I was working in the garden. And occasionally, especially in an open area, she would come and help me dig. She didn't know what I was digging, but she wanted to be right next to me and she would dig too. And I know this is a big issue. I know a lot of people are hesitant to bring their pets out to the garden. They're concerned that the dog is going to dig up the garden. And yes, that happens. I had to put a fence up around the garden so that Shaka wouldn't go in by herself and dig things up, because she knows that she's with me digging and I'm not being restrictive. We're doing it together. So as far as she knows, she can go out to the garden and dig anytime she wants. Well, I had to put a fence around the garden to keep Shaka out when I wasn't there. Just like I had to put a fence around the garden to keep the deer out. And just like I've got fencing around my garden and under my beds now to keep the rabbits and the gophers out. They're animals. Yes, you have to contend with them. They'll do things that you just don't expect. So Shaka and I would play catch with a green tennis ball. And if you've got a dog that likes to play fetch, you've probably done that too. And it took me a while to figure this out. But on a regular basis, this was at an earlier garden before it was fenced, Shaka would go out and come through the dog door into the house with a green tomato in her mouth. And I couldn't figure out why she was harvesting green tomatoes off of my tomato plants. Well, I finally figured out that a green tomato looks like a green tennis ball to a dog. And so while at the time I was annoyed that she kept picking off all these green tomatoes that were within her reach, now I look back at it as such a wonderful memory of her wanting to play fetch with a tomato instead of a tennis ball. And these are just priceless memories. So if you've had pets in your garden, you know what I'm talking about. And that's why I'm encouraging you to add pets to your gardening world. Now, I am planning at some point when I get another dog. Lily is aging and Lily doesn't join me in the garden as much as I would like anymore. But at some point I'll have another dog, and you teach the dog. You teach the dog indoors about what they can do and what they can't do. Well, you can do the same thing outdoors with any pet. Some are more difficult to train than others, but you can still train them to stay out of the beds. You can train them to not dig if you don't want them to dig. You can train them to harvest if you want them to harvest. There are dogs in France that are digging up truffles. So do what you want to do in the way of using the pet to your benefit. But if nothing else, just they're a buddy to help with this gardening journey. And it's so special to just be out there by yourself gardening, but then you realize you're not by yourself. You have someone else there with you to help you in the journey. A best friend at every step of the way. And Shaka was definitely my best friend in the garden. I miss her deeply, but there are just so many wonderful memories that I have from the time that we were able to share. And because they are so special for me, I'm encouraging that you create those same kind of memories, because when those special friends are no longer with us, we have nothing but the memories. And so, Laura, if you're on today or if you watch this on replay, I hope you realize that those memories will always be there, and it's something that makes life special. It makes gardening special. And as I look at Shaka and I relive these memories, this is one of my favorite memories of her lying in the grass. She was looking at me working in the garden. And what can be more special than that, to have those loving eyes with you at every moment, following your every move. And I'm so glad that I had that time to spend with her. And I look forward to the times ahead of the other special friends that I'll be sharing time with in the garden. Just wanted to share that with you, just because I know Laura is grieving, and I know many others who know of my story and Laura's story as well. There's that time of grieving, and it never leaves, but it's just all the good times that we look forward to, and the good times that we remember. And even some of those times that at the time didn't seem like it was good, with the green tomatoes that were being harvested too early. But as we look back, we realize they really were good times. So that's what I want to end with today. That's what I want to leave you with. I hope you can take that and use it to your advantage. If you have pets, bring them out to the garden. And if you're gardening and don't have pets yet, when you get pets, bring them out to the garden. It'll make your experience very, very special and much more enjoyable. So there you have it. Let's see you back here next Monday, same time. It's 11 o'clock Eastern, 8 o'clock Pacific in the mornings on Mondays. I'll be here. I hope to see you here. Thank you so much for sharing your time, and I hope you have a great gardening week. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.